Welcome to this journey through one of the most haunting chapters in Pennsylvania coal country history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will unsettle you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that shook an entire mining community to its foundation, where an abandoned shaft became a graveyard for innocents and left a legacy so disturbing that entire towns conspired to bury the truth deeper than the coal they extracted. A legacy that, when finally brought to light, revealed not just one monster, but an entire system that looked away. It was the year 1938. Europe teetered on the brink of another world war. The Great Depression still gripped America in its suffocating fist, and in the anthracite coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania, desperation had transformed into something far more sinister. In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, where black gold had once promised prosperity, economic collapse had created conditions more brutal than the mines themselves. The town of Carbondale stood as a monument to broken promises, once thriving, now dying, once proud, now desperate. The mines that had drawn thousands of immigrants from Ireland, Poland, Slovakia, and Italy now lay mostly abandoned, their shafts flooding with dark water, their tunnels collapsing inward like the hopes of the people who had come here seeking better lives. Among these forgotten shafts was Number 7. Officially closed in 1932, Number 7 mine had been one of the deepest excavations in the region, dropping nearly 800 feet into the earth. When the company abandoned it, they left behind the standard warnings, erected temporary barriers, posted signs that the wind and rain slowly erased. But they left something else behind too, a perfect hiding place. The mine opening gaped like a wound in the hillside, partially obscured by wild growth that had begun reclaiming the scarred earth. Locals avoided it. Children were warned away from it with threats and ghost stories. Even the desperate men who occasionally ventured into closed mines seeking overlooked coal veins gave Number 7 a wide berth. They said it was cursed. They said strange sounds emerged from its depths on certain nights, sounds that weren't quite the wind, weren't quite water dripping through the eternal darkness, weren't quite the settling groans of deteriorating timber supports. They said it was crying, and they were right. The anthracite region of Pennsylvania stretches across 5 counties, a landscape permanently transformed by a century of extraction. Mountains had been hollowed, valleys filled with calm banks, those massive pyramids of coal waste that still scar the terrain today. Streams ran orange with acid mine drainage. Forests had been stripped to feed the insatiable timber needs of the mines, leaving hillsides vulnerable to erosion and collapse. There, between the Music Mountains and the Endless Mountains, where morning fog clung to the valleys like smoke and winter came early and stayed late, Carbondale had once been called the pioneer city of the anthracite region. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company had struck coal here in 1822, and for over a century the town's fate had been chained to what could be pulled from the earth. But by the late 1930s, that chain had become a noose. The Depression had devastated coal demand. Heating oil and natural gas were replacing coal in homes and factories. The great anthracite boom was ending, and with it, the reason for Carbondale's existence. The population, which had peaked at nearly 20,000, was hemorrhaging. Those who could leave did. Those who remained were trapped by poverty, by lack of options, by the cruel mathematics of economic collapse. The neighborhoods reflected this decay. Patch towns, those company-owned communities built around individual mines, stood half empty, their identical wooden houses weathering into gray anonymity. On Main Street, businesses shuttered one by one. The Grand Opera House that had once hosted touring productions now showed only occasional films to sparse audiences. The hospitals reduced staff. The churches, those magnificent stone structures built with immigrant pride and hope, struggled to maintain their buildings as congregations dwindled. In this environment, shame became a currency more devastating than the lack of actual money. The coal patches had always been places of intense social scrutiny. Immigrant communities, tightly knit by language, nationality, and shared hardship, maintained Old World standards of propriety alongside New World ambitions. Everyone knew everyone. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist in company houses with thin walls and shared yards. For women, this scrutiny was particularly suffocating. An unmarried woman who became pregnant faced complete social destruction, not just for herself, but for her entire family. In communities where reputation determined whether you got hired for the few available jobs, where your standing in the church meant access to charity and support networks, where your family's honor dictated marriage prospects for your siblings, a pregnancy out of wedlock wasn't just a personal crisis. It was a catastrophe that rippled through extended families and ethnic networks. The options were few and grim. Marriage, even forced and loveless, was the preferred solution. But in an economy where young men couldn't afford to support themselves, let alone wives and children, many simply vanished when confronted with pregnancy. They rode the rails looking for work elsewhere, or descended into the bootleg mines, illegal excavations in abandoned shafts where men risked death daily for bags of coal to sell. Illegal abortion was another option, whispered about but rarely discussed openly. Certain women in certain neighborhoods were known to help girls in trouble, using methods that ranged from herbal concoctions to crude surgical interventions. These procedures were dangerous, often fatal. The girls who survived them carried the physical and psychological scars forever. And then there was the third option, the one that no one wanted to acknowledge, the one that happened in darkness and silence, the one that required a place where secrets could be buried so deep that no one would ever find them. A place like Number 7 Mine. The rumors started in the spring of 1938, though later investigators would determine the truth had begun much earlier. Old Mrs. Kowalski, who lived in a patch house near the Number 7 site, mentioned to her daughter that she'd heard babies crying from the direction of the mine. Her daughter dismissed it as imagination, the confusion of an elderly mind, but Mrs. Kowalski insisted. Late at night, she said, when the wind was still, a thin, desperate sound that made her pull the blankets over her head and pray. A group of boys, 13 and 14 years old, playing in the woods near the mine entrance in June, reported seeing a young woman approach the shaft. She carried something wrapped in cloth. She stayed only a few minutes, then left quickly, empty-handed. The boys, curious and brave in the way of young adolescents, approached the mine entrance but didn't go in. One of them thought he heard something from deep within, a sound that made them all run. They told their parents. The parents told them not to spread wild stories. In July, Father Novick at St. Rose of Lima, a church, noted in his private journal that he'd heard confession from 4 different young women in as many weeks, each confessing to grave sins involving their children. He couldn't violate the seal of confession, but the pattern troubled him deeply. He began paying more attention to the young women in his parish, noting which ones had been pregnant and which babies he'd actually baptized. The numbers didn't match. A midwife named Maria Salvator, who had delivered babies in Carbondale for 30 years, mentioned to the county nurse during a routine visit that she'd delivered at least 7 babies in the past year that she'd never seen again. No baptisms announced, no death certificates filed. The mothers claimed they'd given the babies to relatives in other cities, or that the babies had died shortly after birth, and been buried quickly due to poverty. 7 babies, 7 implausible explanations, 7 secrets that Maria Salvator's instincts told her were connected to something darker than she wanted to imagine. The man who would finally drag the truth into daylight was neither a detective nor a sheriff. Jacob Harrington was a mining inspector for the state, a civil servant whose job involved checking that abandoned mines were properly sealed and didn't pose dangers to the public. He was 60, 1 year old in 1938, a lifelong bachelor who had spent his entire career in the anthracite fields. He'd started as a breaker boy at age 9, sorting coal with bleeding fingers. He'd worked his way up to miner, then supervisor, then inspector. He knew the region's geology, its mines, its people, with the intimacy of lived experience. Jacob was a methodical man, quiet and observant. He kept detailed records. He noticed patterns. And in the summer of 1938, when routine paperwork crossed his desk showing that No. 7 mine had never been properly sealed despite being closed for 6 years, he decided to conduct a personal inspection. He set out on August 12th, a Friday morning that started hot and humid. He drove his model of Ford as far up the access road as possible, then walked the final half-mile to the mine entrance, carrying his clipboard, camera, and electric torch. The entrance was more deteriorated than he'd expected. The warning signs had fallen or been vandalized. The wooden barriers had rotted or been torn away for firewood. The opening itself, about 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, gaped dark and uninviting. Jacob stood at the threshold, breathing the cool air that emerged from the depths. The smell was what he noticed first, not the expected odors of damp rock and standing water, but something else. Something organic, something wrong. He clicked on his electric torch and entered. The main tunnel sloped downward at about 15 degrees, its floor covered with puddles and fallen rock. The ceiling timbers groaned above him, heavy with the weight of the mountain. Water dripped steadily, creating that distinctive mine shaft symphony that Jacob knew so well. His footsteps echoed, then were swallowed by the vast emptiness ahead. He descended carefully, testing each step, his torchlight revealing ancient coal dust on the walls, rusted rails where carts had once run, abandoned tools left behind when the mine closed. Typical abandoned mine conditions. 50 feet down, he stopped. Something pale lay just beyond his torchlight's reach. A bundle of cloth, it looked like. Probably just abandoned rags or old burlap sacks, but the smell was stronger here. Noticeably stronger. Jacob approached slowly, his torch beam steady despite his suddenly racing heart. The bundle was too small to be rags, too deliberately placed, too carefully wrapped. He knelt beside it, set down his clipboard, and carefully pulled back a corner of the cloth. The tiny, mummified face that stared back at him from the darkness would haunt Jacob Harrington for the remaining 3 years of his life. But it wouldn't be the only one. Jacob Harrington didn't touch the bundle, didn't move it, didn't unwrap it further. He was a methodical man, and even in his horror, his instincts for proper procedure held. He stood, played his torchlight down the tunnel ahead, and saw more bundles. His breathing became shallow. The mine walls seemed to close in. He counted 3, 4, 5 small shapes visible in the range of his light. And the tunnel continued downward into deeper darkness. Jacob backed out of the mine carefully, his torch beam sweeping constantly, as if the walls themselves might attack him for discovering their secret. When he emerged into the August sunlight, he stood gasping, blinking against the brightness, his hands shaking as he pulled out his notebook and began writing everything he'd seen with the precision of a man who understood that his testimony would matter. Then he walked back to his car and drove directly to the Carbondale Police Department. Chief of Police Daniel O'Brien listened to Jacob's report, with an expression that progressed from skepticism to disbelief to grim acceptance. O'Brien was 45, Irish, a coal miner's son who joined the force during better economic times. He was a competent officer, honest by the standards of the era, but utterly unprepared for what Jacob Harrington was describing. "How many?" O'Brien asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "At least 5 visible from where I stood," Jacob replied. "But Chief, the tunnel goes down another 700 feet. There could be dozens." O'Brien closed his eyes. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Within an hour, O'Brien had assembled a team, 4 officers, the county coroner, Dr. Albert Brennan, 2 volunteers from the fire department equipped with better lighting equipment, and a photographer from the Carbondale Daily News who'd overheard the commotion at the station and refused to be left behind. They arrived at number 7 mine at 3 o'clock that afternoon, a solemn procession climbing the access road in 2 vehicles. The August sun beat down mercilessly, making the cool darkness of the mine entrance seem almost inviting. It was anything but. Dr. Brennan would later testify that the scene inside number 7 mine was the most disturbing he'd encountered in 22 years as a coroner. The team descended with multiple electric torches and gas lanterns, creating an eerie, dancing light that threw grotesque shadows against the tunnel walls. The first bundle lay exactly where Jacob had found it. Dr. Brennan approached it with gloved hands while the photographer set up his camera. The flash powder ignited with a bright pop that echoed unnervingly through the shaft. The doctor carefully unwrapped the cloth, cheap cotton, the kind used for dish towels or infant swaddling. Inside was an infant, deceased, in varying state of decomposition and mummification due to the mine's cool, dry conditions. Male, appeared to be full term, no obvious signs of trauma, but determining cause of death would require examination in better conditions. They placed the remains in a box they'd brought for that purpose, labeled it number 1, and continued deeper. The second bundle was 15 feet further down, female infant, similar condition, similar wrapping. The third, fourth, and fifth were clustered together another 30 feet down the tunnel, as if whoever had brought them had grown tired and desperate to be rid of their burden quickly. At 100 feet into the mine, the tunnel branched. The main shaft continued down to the left. A side drift extended to the right, toward where a coal seam had once been worked. The team split up. Officer Frank Mazur and the photographer went right. They found 3 more bundles in the drift, including one that was significantly older, the cloth nearly rotted away, the remains almost skeletal. Chief O'Brien and Dr. Brennan continued down the main shaft, and here the horror compounded. At 200 feet, they found a cluster of 7 bundles, some stacked almost carelessly atop others. At 250 feet, another 5. The pattern suggested multiple trips, multiple occasions, perhaps multiple perpetrators. And the varying states of decay suggested this had been happening over a period of years. They worked in near silence, speaking only when necessary, methodically documenting and recovering each small body. The mine seemed to swallow sound, creating an oppressive quiet broken only by dripping water, shifting rock, and the occasional gasp or muttered prayer from the recovery team. At 400 feet down, they reached the water line. Below this point, the shaft was flooded with black, still water of unknown depth. They could go no further. Dr. Brennan stared at that dark water for a long moment, his torch beam reflecting off its surface. "How many more are down there, do you think?" he asked quietly. No one answered. They emerged from number 7 mine at 7:30 that evening, having spent 4.5 hours in its depths. They carried 23 boxes, each containing the remains of an infant. 23 3 babies. 20. 3 lives that had begun and ended without record, without ceremony, without anyone apparently caring enough to question their disappearance. The news spread through Carbondale with the speed of wildfire. By the time the recovery team returned to town, crowds had gathered at the police station. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others came because a terrible suspicion was forming. A suspicion about neighbors, relatives, daughters, or granddaughters. Chief O'Brien addressed the crowd briefly, confirming only that multiple deceased infants had been recovered from an abandoned mine shaft and that a full investigation was underway. He refused to provide more details, refused to speculate, refused to answer the shouted questions about how many and who and why. That night, Dr. Brennan began the grim work of examining the remains. He worked through the night and into the next day, creating detailed reports on each infant. His findings would form the backbone of the investigation. All 23 appeared to be full-term or near full-term infants. None showed obvious signs of physical trauma or violence. Condition of the remains varied from recent weeks old to ancient, possibly 5 to 7 years. Both male and female infants were present. The method of wrapping was consistent across most bundles. Cheap cotton cloth, tied with common twine. Several still had scraps of what appeared to be birth caul or membranes, suggesting they'd been wrapped very shortly after birth. The most disturbing finding: several of the more recent infants showed evidence in their lung tissue that suggested they might have been alive when brought to the mine. The cool air, the darkness, the abandonment would have killed them within hours. Exposure, hypothermia, dehydration, alone in absolute darkness. State police investigators arrived on Sunday, August 14th. Detective Lieutenant William Reeves, a veteran investigator from Harrisburg, took charge of the case. Reeves was a stern man, former military, with no patience for stonewalling or small-town politics. He quickly realized that solving this case would require breaking through walls of silence built from shame, fear, and complicity. The investigation began with the obvious question: who had given birth to these babies? Reeves ordered a canvass of every hospital, clinic, and midwife within 50 miles. He wanted records of every birth in the past 7 years, official records, unofficial records, anything that might help identify the mothers. The results were simultaneously enlightening and frustrating. The hospitals had records, but hospital births cost money. Most poor families used midwives. The midwives had some records, but many births went unrecorded, particularly if families were undocumented immigrants or were trying to hide a pregnancy for some reason. What became clear was that there were gaps: pregnant women who'd been seen by neighbors or midwives, but whose babies never appeared; stories of stillbirths that were never reported; babies supposedly sent to live with relatives in other cities, none of whom could be tracked down or verified. Reeves estimated that in the Carbondale area alone, at least 40 pregnancies over the past 7 years had ended with no clear documentation of what happened to the babies. 23 bodies in the mine, 17 others unaccounted for. Were they in other abandoned mines? Were they the babies that had actually survived? Or were they somewhere else in number 7, deeper than the recovery team had searched, below the waterline in that flooded shaft? Detective Reeves began bringing in women for questioning. He started with those identified by midwife Maria Salvator, the ones who'd given birth but whose babies had mysteriously vanished. The interviews took place in a small room at the police station, with a stenographer recording everything. Most of the women denied everything at first. They stuck to their stories about stillbirths, about babies sent away, about misunderstandings. But Reeves was patient and relentless. He showed them photographs from the mine, not of the bodies, but of the cloth, the twine, the specific details of how the babies had been wrapped. And he told them about the babies who'd been alive, that broke many of them. The first to confess was a young Polish woman named Anna Kowalczyk. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and had worked in a textile mill until it closed. In March of 1938, she'd given birth to a baby girl. The father was a married man who'd promised to leave his wife, but disappeared when Anna revealed her pregnancy. Anna had hidden the pregnancy as long as possible, wearing loose clothing, avoiding social occasions. When labor came, her sister helped deliver the baby in their shared bedroom while their mother was at church. The baby was healthy, crying, perfect, but Anna was terrified. If anyone found out, she'd be shunned. Her family would be disgraced. Her younger sister's marriage prospects would be destroyed. They'd all be marked, stained by her sin. Her sister had suggested the mine. They'd heard whispers that other girls had solved their problems this way. Number 7 was far from town, rarely visited, deep enough that no sounds would carry. They could leave the baby there, and no one would ever know. God would judge them, but at least their earthly lives would continue. Anna wrapped her 3-hour-old daughter in a kitchen towel, placed her in a basket, and walked to number 7 mine at 2 o'clock in the morning. She descended only far enough that the darkness was complete, placed the basket on the ground, and fled. She never looked back, never allowed herself to think about how long her daughter cried in that darkness, never acknowledged what she'd done, even to herself, until Detective Reeves placed those photographs before her. Anna's confession was the crack in the dam. Over the next 2 weeks, 11 more women came forward with similar stories. Each was slightly different in details, but horrifyingly similar in structure. Young, unmarried, pregnant, desperate, no access to abortion, no ability to marry, no resources to support a child. Pressure from family members to hide the shame, knowledge that other girls had used the mine, a terrible night journey, carrying a wrapped infant, a descent into darkness, an abandonment, a lifetime of buried guilt. But these confessions accounted for only 12 of the 23 babies. Where were the other mothers? The answer came from an unexpected source, Father Novak. The priest had been wrestling with his conscience since the discovery. He couldn't violate the seal of confession, but he could make general statements about what he'd learned. In a private meeting with Detective Reeves, he revealed a pattern that had emerged in the confessional booth. Some of the babies in that mine hadn't been put there by their mothers. They'd been put there by their mothers' families. In several cases, young women had given birth without even knowing they were pregnant, or having been kept ignorant deliberately by mothers and aunts who'd recognized the signs. The babies had been taken immediately after birth, before the young mothers had even seen them, and disposed of by older women who believed they were protecting their daughters and their families. In other cases, women who'd given birth had been pressured, coerced, or even physically forced by parents, siblings, or other relatives to take their babies to the mine. The shame belonged to the whole family. The solution had to involve the whole family. This revelation shifted the investigation dramatically. Reeves began looking at older women, matriarchs of families where young women had mysteriously been pregnant and then not. He found a network of complicity that extended across ethnic lines, across neighborhoods, across the entire social structure of Carbondale's working class. They'd all known, they'd all been involved, directly or indirectly. They'd all maintained the silence. But Reeves was certain there was more, someone who'd actively facilitated this horror, someone who'd spread the knowledge that number 7 mine was available for this purpose. That someone was Agnes Thornton. Agnes was 67 years old, a widow, a woman who'd lived in Carbondale since 1905. She'd worked as a domestic servant, a laundress, and occasionally as an unlicensed midwife. She was known in certain circles as a woman who could help girls in trouble. Detective Reeves brought her in for questioning on August 28th. Agnes was small, gray-haired, with sharp eyes and a mouth set in permanent disapproval. She initially denied knowing anything about number 7 mine or dead babies, but Reeves had done his homework. He had testimony from 3 women who said Agnes had explicitly told them about the mine, had given them directions, had even offered to accompany them. When confronted with this testimony, Agnes's demeanor changed. She leaned back in her chair and looked at Reeves with something approaching contempt. "You don't understand how it is for these girls," she said. "You men never do." "Then explain it to me," Reeves replied. What followed was a 40-minute statement that the stenographer captured verbatim, a statement that would become central to the subsequent legal proceedings. Agnes explained that she'd first learned about using number 7 from another woman, now deceased, back in 1932. She'd had her own reasons for needing to know about such places, a granddaughter's crisis that she wouldn't detail. Since then, she'd helped perhaps 15 or 16 girls, though she claimed not to remember exactly how many. She didn't take money, she insisted. This wasn't a business, it was mercy, these girls. Agnes said, "They have no choices. You think they want to do this, they're trapped. If they keep the babies, they destroy their lives and their families' lives. The church condemns them. Society shuns them. They can't get work, can't get married, can't have normal lives. And the babies, who's going to raise them? Grandmothers who can barely feed the children they already have. The state, orphanages that are overflowing. Those babies would have grown up in poverty and shame, unwanted and resented. So you helped kill them instead," Reeves said flatly. "I helped end suffering before it could begin." Agnes replied, "I make no apologies." The investigation concluded in September of 1938. District Attorney Patrick Morrison, after reviewing all the evidence and testimony, made the difficult decision about who to charge. 11 women who'd confessed to bringing their own babies to the mine were charged with voluntary manslaughter. The charges acknowledged the desperate circumstances while still holding them accountable for their actions. 5 family members, mothers, aunts, and 1 grandmother who'd brought infants to the mine without the birth mother's knowledge or against their will, were charged with murder. Agnes Thornton was charged with 11 counts of being an accessory to manslaughter and 3 counts of accessory to murder. The arrests tore Carbondale apart. Families were divided. Churches struggled with how to respond. Some community members expressed sympathy for the desperate circumstances that had driven these women to such terrible acts. Others demanded harsh punishment, viewing the crimes as evidence of moral decay. The trials would last through the winter of 1938 into the spring of 1939, a series of devastating public reckonings with secrets that had festered in darkness. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Agnes Thornton began on November 7, 1938, in the Lackawanna County Courthouse. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Morrison, had a straightforward case. Agnes had knowingly facilitated infanticide multiple times, had advised women on how to commit the acts, and in at least 2 cases had accompanied them to the mine. The defense, appointed by the court since Agnes couldn't afford private counsel, argued that Agnes had no legal duty to report suspected crimes, that she'd never directly participated in any killings, and that her actions, while morally questionable, didn't constitute criminal accessory under Pennsylvania law. The trial lasted 6 days. Witnesses included Detective Reeves, Dr. Brennan, and 4 of the young women Agnes had helped. The testimony was devastating. One woman, Clara Romano, described how Agnes had come to her home 3 days after she'd given birth. Clara was hemorrhaging, weak, terrified that she was dying, and desperate about the crying infant she couldn't keep. Agnes had evaluated Clara's physical condition, provided some herbal remedies for the bleeding, and then calmly explained the solution to her problem. She told me exactly where to go, exactly how far down the tunnel to walk, exactly what to wrap the baby in. Clara testified, crying. She said it would be quick, that the baby wouldn't suffer long, that God would understand even if the church didn't. "Did you follow her instructions?" Morrison asked. "Yes," Clara whispered. "What happened to your baby?" Clara broke down completely, unable to answer. The judge called a recess. The defense tried to paint Agnes as a misguided Good Samaritan, a woman who tried to help desperate girls in the only way available to her in a world that offered no real solutions. They pointed out that Agnes herself had never killed anyone, had never profited from these tragic situations, had genuinely believed she was preventing greater suffering. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They found Agnes Thornton guilty on 9 counts of accessory to manslaughter and 1 count of accessory to murder. On January 12, 1939, Judge Harold McConnell sentenced her to 15 to 30 years in state prison. Agnes, standing to receive her sentence, showed no emotion. "I regret nothing," she told the court. "History will judge me more kindly than you do." She was 60, 8 years old. She would die in prison 7 years later, in 1946, never having expressed remorse for her role in the deaths of at least 12 infants. The trials of the women who'd brought their own babies to number 7 mine were shorter, and, in some ways, more complex. These cases exposed the terrible intersection of poverty, shame, and desperation that had created the conditions for such horror. The prosecution had to balance justice for the victims against understanding the impossible circumstances these women had faced. The defense had to acknowledge the gravity of what had been done while contextualizing the desperation that had driven these actions. Anna Kowalczyk's trial was representative of the others. Her attorney presented evidence of her circumstances: unemployed, living in poverty, shunned by the baby's father, responsible for helping support her widowed mother and 3 younger siblings. A psychological evaluation described her as deeply depressed, suffering from what we'd now recognize as postpartum depression compounded by trauma and despair. The testimony revealed that Anna had seriously considered killing herself and the baby together, but her sister had suggested the mine as an alternative. In Anna's confused state, abandoning the baby had seemed marginally less terrible than murder, suicide. "I thought maybe someone would find her," Anna testified. "I know that sounds insane now, but I convinced myself someone might hear her crying and rescue her. I couldn't think straight. I just wanted the nightmare to end." Expert witnesses testified about the psychological state of women in desperate circumstances, about how poverty and shame could create a kind of temporary insanity, about how the brain under extreme stress makes decisions that seem incomprehensible in retrospect. The juries in these cases were sympathetic but not lenient. The circumstances were mitigating, but babies had died. Justice required accountability. Anna Kowalczyk was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. She served 4 years, was released in 1943, and lived the rest of her life under an assumed name in Ohio, never marrying, never having children, dying in 1978, without ever publicly speaking about her case again. The other women received similar sentences. 3 to 10 years, with most serving 4 to 6 years. Their lives were effectively ended, even after their releases. They carried the weight of what they'd done, and what had been done to them by a society that condemned their pregnancies but offered no support, forever. The trials of family members who'd taken babies to the mine without the mother's knowledge or consent were the most contentious. These cases involved clear murder charges, the taking of another person's child, and causing its death. The most shocking case involved a woman named Margaret Sullivan, age 53, who'd taken her 16-year-old daughter Catherine's baby to No. 7 mine while Catherine was still sedated. After a difficult delivery, Catherine had never even known she'd given birth to a live child. Margaret had told her that the baby had been stillborn and immediately buried. Catherine only learned the truth when police came to question her mother. The courtroom scene when Catherine testified against her own mother was heartbreaking. She described the pregnancy, the result of rape by a boarder in their home, and her mother's determination to hide it. She described waking up after delivery to be told the baby was dead, and believing that for months until Detective Reeves arrived at their door. "She took my baby," Catherine said on the stand, staring at her mother. "She murdered my baby and told me it was God's will. She looked me in the eyes every day and lied to me about what she'd done." Margaret Sullivan's defense was that she'd done what she thought was necessary to protect her daughter's future. The baby had been the product of rape. Raising it would have been a constant reminder of trauma. Catherine was just 16. She couldn't care for a child, couldn't support a child, would have been ruined by the scandal. "I did what any mother would do to protect her child," Margaret testified. "I made the hard choice so Catherine wouldn't have to." The jury was not persuaded. Margaret Sullivan was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. She served 22 years before dying of cancer in 1961. 4 other family members received similar convictions and sentences ranging from 15 years to life. Their trials revealed a culture of patriarchal control where older women, particularly mothers and grandmothers, felt entitled to make life and death decisions for younger women without their knowledge or consent. While the trials proceeded, Carbondale itself underwent a painful process of self-examination. The case had drawn national attention. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the mine shaft babies. Radio programs discussed the case. Sociologists and criminologists descended on the town to study the social conditions that had enabled such horror. The Catholic Church, which dominated the region's religious landscape, issued statements condemning the killings while also acknowledging the desperation of poverty and the lack of resources for unwed mothers. Several parishes began organizing support networks for pregnant women, though these efforts were limited by the same economic constraints that had contributed to the crisis in the first place. The Protestant churches were less unified in their response. Some ministers preached sermons about moral decay and the wages of sin. Others focused on mercy and redemption. A few, to their credit, examined their own complicity in creating a culture of judgment that had driven desperate women to such extreme measures. Secular organizations also responded. The county established a more robust public health system, with better tracking of births and maternal health. Social workers began conducting home visits to check on pregnant women and new mothers. The state legislature passed laws requiring more thorough sealing of abandoned mines. But the fundamental economic and social structures that had created the conditions for the No. 7 tragedy remained largely unchanged. The Depression continued. The coal industry continued its decline. Young women continued to get pregnant out of wedlock, and the social stigma remained crushing. What changed was knowledge. After No. 7, Everyone knew what desperation could drive people to do. The secret was out, and perhaps that awareness itself prevented other women from following that dark path, though no one could ever be certain. On April 15, 1939, after all the trials had concluded and all the remains had been examined, Carbondale held a collective burial for the 23 infants from number 7 mine. The service took place at St. Rose of Lime, a cemetery, on a cold spring morning that threatened rain. A common grave had been prepared, a single large plot that would hold all 23 small coffins. Each coffin was identical, simple pine painted white, each inscribed with only infant and a number. Infant 1 through infant 23, names unknown, parents known but not inscribed, lives unmeasured except in weeks or days or hours. The service was ecumenical, attended by hundreds of people from across Carbondale's ethnic and religious communities. Father Novick led the Catholic portion of the service. A Presbyterian minister offered prayers. A rabbi from a neighboring town spoke about the sanctity of all life. A representative from the Polish National Catholic Church sang a hymn in Polish that had been sung at children's funerals for centuries. Many of the women from the trials were already in prison and couldn't attend, but their family members came, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, standing at the graveside with expressions of grief and shame and anger and loss so complex that no single emotion could capture what they felt. Detective Reeves attended, standing at the back of the crowd. He'd seen terrible things in his career, but nothing had affected him like the recovery from number 7 mine. He would retire from the state police in 1941, citing the emotional toll of the case as his primary reason for leaving law enforcement. Dr. Brennan attended, though he looked 10 years older than he had the previous August. He'd examined every one of those babies, had written detailed reports about their short lives and deaths, had testified in trial after trial. The work had hollowed him out. He would move away from Carbondale in 1940, taking a position in a hospital in Philadelphia where he wouldn't have to know every family whose tragedies he documented. Jacob Harrington attended, the man whose decision to conduct a routine inspection had uncovered the horror. He stood near the grave, staring at the coffins, and wept openly. He discovered terrible things in his long career inspecting mines, collapsed sections that had killed men, dangerous conditions that had maimed workers, evidence of negligence that had caused suffering, but this was different. This wasn't accident or negligence. This was deliberate, repeated, systemic destruction of the most innocent lives imaginable. As the coffins were lowered into the earth, someone began singing Amazing Grace. Others joined in, voices carrying across the cemetery, across the culm banks visible in the distance, across the scarred landscape of coal country where dreams had died along with these babies. A simple monument was erected, in memory of 23 innocents lost to desperation, found in darkness, now resting in light. April 15, 1939. After the burial, state inspectors returned to number 7 mine with equipment and materials to seal it properly and permanently. They installed heavy steel grating across the entrance, poured concrete reinforcements, and erected new warning signs. But before they sealed it, they conducted one final search, bringing in professional divers to explore the flooded section of the main shaft below the 400-foot mark. What they found there would never be disclosed to the public. Detective Reeves's final report, filed in May of 1939, contains one enigmatic paragraph. Divers recovered additional evidence from the flooded section of number 7 mine, consistent with the nature of the previously discovered remains. This evidence has been documented, photographed, and secured. Due to the advanced state of deterioration and the impossibility of Individual identification, formal recovery, and separate burial was deemed impractical. The remains will remain in situ. The mine has been permanently sealed. How many more babies were in that dark water? 5, 10, 20? No one would ever officially say. But workers involved in the sealing operation told their families, and those families whispered to others. And eventually the rumor spread that the divers had found at least 15 more small bundles in the flooded shaft. If true, that would bring the total to 30, 8 infants. 30, 8 lives ended in darkness. 30, 8 secrets carried to number 7 mine by desperate women over the course of at least 7 years, probably longer. 30, 8 babies who'd never had a chance to breathe free air, to feel sunlight, to be wanted and loved and given the chance to grow into whoever they might have become. The number 7 mine case had ripples that extended far beyond Carbondale. Social reformers cited it as evidence of the need for better support systems for unwed mothers. Religious leaders used it in debates about moral responsibility versus practical compassion. Legal scholars examined it in the context of laws around infanticide, abortion, and women's autonomy. In 1940, Pennsylvania passed the Maternal and Infant Welfare Act, which established state funding for homes for unwed mothers, provided some financial assistance for single mothers who chose to keep their babies, and created better systems for adoption. The law was directly inspired by the number 7 case, though it was far from perfect and faced constant funding challenges. Similar laws were passed in other states throughout the 1940s and 50s. While these laws didn't solve the underlying problems of poverty and social stigma, they at least provided some alternatives to desperate measures. The women involved in the case, those who survived prison and were released, lived under the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives. Most changed their names, moved away, tried to build new lives in places where no one knew their stories. A few, like Anna Kowalczyk, never could escape the psychological burden and lived isolated, haunted lives until death released them. Agnes Thornton's prediction that history would judge her more kindly never came to pass. She remains in historical records as an example of misguided mercy turned monstrous, a woman who'd rationalized participation in infanticide as humanitarian work. The families of Carbondale never fully recovered either. The revelation that neighbors, relatives, even family members had participated in or known about the mine shaft killings created fractures in the community that lasted for generations. Trust, once broken so fundamentally, was difficult to rebuild. Number 7 mine itself became a local legend, a place avoided even after it was sealed. Children were warned away from it with stories that mixed truth and embellishment until the real horror was obscured by ghost stories. In 1970, too, the mine entrance area was finally bulldozed and covered over completely as part of a mine reclamation project. A small parking area sits there now with no marker, no indication of what lies beneath. Only old timers remember. Only historians know, and the babies in the cemetery at St. Rose of Lima, infant 1 through infant 23, remains silent testimony to what desperation can drive people to do when society offers judgment without support, condemnation without compassion, rules without resources. The number 7 mine case was not unique. As the decades have passed and more historical records have been examined, similar cases have come to light across the industrialized world. In England, the bodies in the walls cases of the 19th and early 20th centuries revealed hundreds of infant remains hidden in the structures of buildings, particularly in areas where domestic servants, often victims of sexual exploitation by their employers, had no way to seek help or support. In Ireland, the Tuam mother and baby home scandal revealed the remains of nearly 800 babies buried in a septic tank system between 1925 and 1961, children of unwed mothers who'd been sent to institutions run by the Catholic Church. In Japan, post-World War, 2 investigations uncovered multiple cases of abandoned babies in remote locations, driven by economic devastation and social stigma. In Germany, Australia, Canada, and across Europe and the Americas, similar stories have emerged of desperate measures taken by desperate women in desperate times, each case a testament to the universal failure to provide support for the most vulnerable. The Carbondale case stands out not because it was unique, but because it was documented, prosecuted, and used as a catalyst for reform. Many similar tragedies went undiscovered, uninvestigated, and forgotten by everyone except the women who carried the secrets and the guilt until their deaths. Even with extensive investigation and multiple trials, questions about the number 7 mine case remain unanswered. How many babies were actually in that mine? The official count is 20, 3 recovered bodies, but the rumors of 30, 8 or more, have never been definitively disproven. The sealed flooded section of the shaft may hold secrets that will never be revealed. How long had the mine been used for this purpose? The earliest remains that could be dated were from approximately 1930, 1 or 32, but Agnes Thornton claimed to have learned about the practice from another woman who's now deceased. Did the killings start when the mine closed in 1930, 2, or had it been happening even while the mine was still operational? Were there other mines used similarly? Number 7 was far from the only abandoned mine in the region. Detective Reeves's final report noted that his investigation had uncovered rumors of similar practices at other sites, but that no evidence had been found. Those rumors persisted for decades. In the 1960s, when mines were being reclaimed and sealed more systematically, workers reported finding suspicious remains in at least 3 other locations, but official records are scarce. Who were all the fathers? The trials focused on the mothers and those who helped them, but the men who'd impregnated these desperate young women were largely absent from the legal proceedings. Some were married men who'd fled their responsibilities, some were boyfriends who'd vanished, some were rapists who were never prosecuted. The patriarchal structure that created the crisis went largely unexamined, with blame falling almost entirely on the women involved. Could it happen today? The laws are different now. Support systems exist that didn't in 1938, and social stigma around unmarried pregnancy has diminished significantly in many places. But poverty persists, desperation persists, and in parts of the world where abortion is illegal or inaccessible and single motherhood remains socially unacceptable, women still face impossible choices. The specifics change, but the underlying crisis of women with no good options continues to manifest in various tragic ways. The number 7 mine case resonates differently in the 21st century than it did in 1938. We live in an era of safer abortion access in many places, better contraception, more social services, and less stigma around unmarried parenthood. The specific circumstances that created the Carbondale tragedy seem, in many ways, like relics of a more primitive time. And yet, safe haven laws now exist in all 50 U.S. states, allowing parents to surrender newborns at designated locations without fear of prosecution. These laws exist because babies are still being abandoned not in mine shafts typically, but in dumpsters, bathrooms, wooded areas. The desperation that drove the women of Carbondale still exists, even if the manifestations have changed. The debate around abortion access, adoption, foster care, and support for single parents continues with the same intensity that surrounded these issues in the 1930s. The number 7 case is sometimes cited by both sides of these debates, each drawing different lessons from the tragedy. What's clear is that judgment without support, condemnation without compassion, creates the conditions for desperate acts. The women who brought their babies to number 7 mine were not monsters. They were human beings pushed beyond the limits of what they could endure, making terrible choices in the absence of better options. Agnes Thornton was wrong to facilitate infanticide, but she was right that these women had no good choices. Recognizing both truths simultaneously is necessary to understand the case and to prevent similar tragedies. The story of number 7 mine remains one of the most disturbing chapters in American coal country history, a stark reminder that the economic and social structures we create have real consequences. For the most vulnerable members of society, 23 babies, probably more, died in darkness because the world above ground offered their mothers no path forward that didn't lead to destruction. But questions linger in the shadows of those sealed tunnels. How many more sites like number 7 existed across industrial America? How many other communities carried similar secrets? How many women lived their entire lives with the knowledge of what they'd done, what they'd been driven to do, in moments of desperation that we can barely imagine today? To this day, hikers in the Carbondale area occasionally report finding small bundles of cloth in remote locations, probably nothing more than discarded rags, but enough to make them wonder. Local historians receive periodic inquiries about other abandoned mines, other rumors, other possible tragedies buried too deep for justice to reach. And on silent autumn nights, when the wind moves through the valleys of coal country and the old timers gather to share stories, someone inevitably mentions number 7. They talk about the crying that Mrs. Kowalski heard before the discovery. They speculate about what really lies in that flooded shaft. They remember the burial on that cold April morning in 1939, when an entire community stood together in acknowledgement of a collective failure. The mine entrance is gone now, covered by decades of reclamation work and new growth, but the cemetery at St. Rose of Lima remains, and the simple monument still stands. 23 innocents, lost to desperation, found in darkness, now resting in light. 23 lives that barely began. 23 sets of tiny bones laid to rest together. 23 reminders that how we treat the most desperate among us reveals who we truly are as a society. If this journey through one of history's darkest corners has moved you, if you find yourself contemplating the complex intersections of poverty, shame, and desperation that can drive human beings to unthinkable acts, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with honesty and empathy, historical events that challenge us to look unflinchingly at who we were and who we've become. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own thoughts on how society should balance judgment and compassion, justice and mercy, in cases where desperation drives people to terrible choices. How do we honor victims while understanding perpetrators? How do we prevent such tragedies without resorting to simplistic moralizing? Until next time, remember that history's darkest chapters teach us the most about ourselves, if we're brave enough to learn. This has been the Untold Hour.